So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of our research that we've been doing for many years now of really trying to think about what is the additional use of different kinds of data sets and how can we be using some of these data to really help inform our understanding of disease transmission models. And so much of our research has been focused on human mobility patterns. And so we really care about not just how are people moving, but how are people moving in a way that is relevant for the disease process we're interested in. So for example, if we're interested in a child pathogen, we might be really interested in understanding how kids are moving. And so we really think about mobility as sort of this general population-based phenomenon, but really through the lens of, well, what pathogen are we looking at? What are the policies that are in place? And what are the sort of interventions we might want to consider? And so this is not a new problem at all. So this has been long an issue. Here's an example of a couple different things historically about sort of the spread of different pathogens that were all driven by human travel. So you have everything from smallpox or measles, thanks to Columbus, down to sort of the first SARS-CoV-1 epidemic that occurred in 2002 to 2004. And as many people know now, also we're really interested in thinking about this, not just sort of on these bigger timescales. Some of those outbreaks occurred over decades, but also thinking on shorter timescales, as in the case with the COVID-19 pandemic, of really trying to understand sort of as we implement different kinds of interventions, what's the impact on mobility and what's the impact on sort of human interaction that might reduce disease transmission. And so a lot of our work is thinking sort of both between sort of like the mobility data and models and how those can be used in conjunction with and informed by the different disease dynamics and policy. And a lot of our work is really focused on thinking about the real utility of models, because I think one of the main benefits of models are if you don't have data or you have very limited data, it can sort of be much more informative before you're able to collect data or maybe when you're sort of more limited. And so first, I'm going to talk a little bit about that aspect of things and about the data. And so there's many, many different ways that we can measure human mobility. We could do surveys for people. We could put GPS loggers on individuals. We can use different things like the census or airline data. And all of these different data sets are going to cover sort of different areas in terms of the spatial scale and also the temporal scale. So in some instances, we might be able to get really, really fine detail about human mobility pattern from using GPS loggers or travel surveys, or quite coarse data maybe over between different countries or over very large timescales with something like the census data. But as with all data, there's always going to be a number of trade-offs and issues. So some data sets like GPS loggers, you might only be able to enroll a very small number of individuals. Other data sets that might be more population representative. The census is designed to be representative of the entire country. That might only be collected every 5 years. There's a number of countries that haven't collected migration questions and censuses since like the 70s. So these data might be really outdated, even though you might have fewer biases in terms of thinking about the representativeness for the entire population. Here's one example here. So this is just the number of international airports and the log population size in 2017. Airline data is really commonly used a lot to try to say, global spread of different types of infectious diseases. But as you can see, so all of the countries in Africa are shown in red. There's definitely a disconnect between sort of the population sizes and how many international airports you have. This also is unlikely to capture a lot of the movement that you might be interested in. So for a lot of pathogens, you really care about something like commuting or where kids go to school or something like that. And so international airports, while it might sort of show one lens onto how one particular country might be connected globally, is not really going to get a lot of the vast majority of mobility that might actually be driving disease transmission. And it also would miss all the things about sort of like land crossings or by water, for example. So a lot of our work is really focused on using mobile phone data and sort of leveraging the fact that many, many, many people own a mobile phone. And mobile phones sort of are able to measure where you're geolocated, either by GPS or by mobile phone cell towers when you're making calls or using data or text messages. And even in really, really low, very, very rural areas, increasingly there's even mobile phone signal. Maybe not like data signal, but like old school Nokia Nokia brick phones are still working like in many places around the world. And so a lot of our work has really been trying to sort of leverage the fact that this might be a data set that's sort of being passively collected by mobile phone operators. It's getting stored. They might have millions and millions of subscribers in a country, and being able to use this to try to get a lens onto how people might be moving. And one of the benefits is that increasingly over time, many, many adults are owning mobile phones. And what we do and how we sort of analyze these data are you have your mobile phone records that are every single company will collect billing records. That's how they also know how to do some like targeted advertisement and things like that. Of where you're sort of making or receiving calls or text messages, or in some instances also data. So what we do is we look for different subscribers. And so this might be two examples here where we have two different users of where they're sort of spending their time throughout the day. This is not a perfect measure. It's not the same as a GPS that might be regularly pinning at a very fine granular level. It might be much coarser. And, people have multiple SIM cards, people share mobile phones. So it's not necessarily going to be a one-to-one match of that person. It's also often going to have some biases in who is using mobile phones. Nonetheless, we still use it all the time. So what we do then is we are trying to take these kinds of very granular data and extract out sort of how many trips are between different locations, or maybe some other kinds of measures about where individuals are spending their time at home or at work. And sometimes there's even metadata that's attached. So we're able to look and see how that relates to different mobility patterns across ages, for example. There are issues with data. And so for example, if we're interested in trying to understand mobility of the entire population in blue, mobile phone owners is going to be a subset of that data. So things like billing records would still capture a decent proportion of the adult population. But then as you get down, maybe you want like GPS data, then you're relying on smartphone owners, and that's sort of like part of the overall pie of the human population that you're trying to measure is going to keep getting smaller. There are some particular biases, for example, and one of the main ones, so Natalia is a PhD student at Hopkins that she's working on, is what is the bias that we miss using mobile phone data about children's movements. So we also work on a lot of childhood diseases. And so thinking about, you measure mobile phone operators, but how many of those trips might actually be by children, which is the population we're actually interested in. Nonetheless, we have been hoarding and collecting a lot of these data in many, many different countries, and then applying them for a lot of different applications for different infectious diseases. And so we've been working with telecom regulators and mobile phone operators in many different settings to be able to try to analyze, anonymize, and extract these data to then be used for a wide range of different public health applications. So really, though, we want this to ultimately be able to help us understand sort of the disease dynamics and the policy. And there's lots of different ways that these data can be used across from emerging to eliminating pathogens. So for SARS-CoV-2, for example, really trying to understand the initial stages of the pandemic and that spatial spread, all the way down to things that we might be trying to eliminate, like measles, and really trying to look at some importation risks into different settings. So now I'm just going to kind of go through like a couple examples of random pathogens that are some of my favorites of showing how we've sort of been able to use these data. So this is work that was done at the beginning of the pandemic with Lai and Andy Tatum, who are both at the University of Southampton, where we use data from Baidu to actually look at changes in mobility to try to look at the impact of different types of interventions, and then sort of show if you add in different kinds of interventions, what would be sort of the impact on the number of cases. This is work with Jess Metcalf at Princeton, where we were looking at rubella. So rubella is a directly transmitted vaccine preventable disease. It's very similar in presentation to measles, looking at rubella dynamics and seasonal fluctuations in how people are moving, and trying to relate sort of those seasonal patterns we see in transmission to seasonal patterns we see in mobility, and how well can the mobility data be predicting when we expect higher transmission of rubella. This is also work that we did with Sophonius and Brian at UCSF, and Sophonius is now at Africa CDC, thinking not just about sort of one type of mobility data, but multiple types of mobility data. Similar to the previous presentation, we also used genomic data to try to understand like So we have people moving and we have mobile phone data, which isn't necessarily a direct map onto who's actually infected with malaria. And then we have travel survey data, but then also can we measure the parasite directly? So malaria pathogen genomics is a little bit complicated because you have people who have many parasites infecting them at once. But we wanted to try to see sort of like if we use all these different kind of data sets together, how well does that inform some of our inference? And in particular, what we started to look at in terms of control of malaria in Namibia, it's part of the E8 countries. And so there's a lot of issues about cross-border movement and cross-border transmission of malaria. And so one outcome that we were really interested in, both for the national control program in Namibia, but also the E8 region in general, was thinking about how well do these different data sets combine to help estimate this question about border malaria and importation across different settings. So one of the issues that we've always sort of come across is, these data, like they sound super cool. They're like, ooh, look, we can collect all these data. They just like are sitting somewhere and then we just have to like woo Safaricom and then they'll give us all the data. But this often takes like a number of years to be able to actually access the data. So if you're interested in something like happening now, for example, you either would have kind of needed a lot of those agreements in place a priori, or you'd have to figure out a way to get sort of like mobile phone operators, the telecom regulators, and everyone to sort of jump on board quite quickly. So the COVID-19 pandemic has made this a little bit easier in that it's been demonstrated that these data can be useful, but it's still often like quite difficult to be able to access all these data and access them in a way that they can actually go directly to sort of public health agencies and not have to spend sort of time getting filtered through sort of academic institutions too. And if we ultimately are really interested in like using data and models to do some sort of real-time-ish decision making, one area we've really focused is how we can leverage the data that we've been spending time getting and acquiring to really be able to understand like the models that might go into some of these disease dynamics. And so this is just some work of sort of trying to look and see, there's many models of mobility. Most of those models have been initially fit in Europe and the US. So we've done a lot of work to try to understand and see like what is actually, how well are those models fitting to data in other settings and how much is the poor fits sort of mechanistic in that there's different kinds of mobility patterns that might not be represented in those forms versus sort of how much is the poor fit based off a lack of data or a lack of understanding. So we've been doing some work about sort of making sort of generalized models and mobility models that anyone can kind of use that are at least fit to other settings that might be a little bit more similar. And also thinking about other dimensions of travel and how we include that in our models too. One thing is about sort of thinking not just where people are going, but how long they're staying. And so we're doing some work to investigate that too. And figure out sort of what's the implications for a wide range of different infectious diseases. So one other final bit about sort of thinking about models and things is thinking about how mobility changes over time. So the COVID-19 pandemic is sort of a great example. One of the only benefits of the COVID-19 pandemic is it has made some data available. Everything else has been a dumpster fire. But one of the things that we've been interested in thinking about sort of mobility models and how they're also changing over time. So this is with Rohan, who's a postdoc at Hopkins, where we sort of had data across the US from many different zip code areas that sort of represented really diverse geographies. And also in the US, there is like very piecemeal interventions put in place. So we are also interested in looking at the effectiveness of different interventions with changes in mobility. Everywhere, there was like very sharp decreases in mobility, regardless of interventions, regardless of case counts, sort of across the entire US. But what also changed is sort of not just how much travel went down, but also how much travel rebounded and when that occurred. And so we've been working on sort of developing models to look at sort of when you have different kinds of interventions in place and sort of different receptivity to those interventions in different settings. What are the actual types of routes that are kind of changing? Not just everyone stayed home for a little while, but what is the routes that actually decreased? And then what are the trips that actually came back, regardless of the interventions that are in place? And so for my final little bit, I'm just going to talk a little bit about trying to sort of think a little bit more broadly about what we've actually learned from all of this. There's been a great increase in sort of work of both about integrating models and mobility data to help inform decision making. During the initial stages of the pandemic, we, as like many other disease modelers, were actually working directly in state and city and national departments of health, and they actually wanted like models, which we never really thought would ever happen. And there's also been sort of a glut of research sort of along this area. And so what we've been now doing is thinking a little bit about, okay, so we had this time when sort of great increase in research has happened, a great integration of models or attempts to integrate models into decision making. But what have we really kind of learned about that? So we have been very slowly going through this systematic review to try to really look at papers that were focused on sort of mobility and SARS-CoV-2. There was about 4,000 or 5,000 abstracts that were screened and really focused on what have we been able to learn from all of this work and all of this research. And so as expected, sort of there's a wide range of different kinds of data sets that were being used and different data sets across different settings. So these are the countries that had the most papers reported. And there was a really large sort of increase in the use of mobile phone data, which previously had not happened. But if we actually think about sort of where are these papers being conducted and where are we getting a lot more information from? So we did like a deep reading of about 300 papers or so, and actually only 3 of those focused in Africa at all. Pretty much they were predominantly dominated by either global projections, the US, China, or parts of Europe. So in terms of really being able to leverage these data and use these data and understand more things about mobility and disease transmission, we still have a number of gaps, particularly spatially. Just a couple of the things, thinking about sort of relating to some of the issues about metadata and stuff, we also really found that one of the good things was, which a lot of models have been critiqued with before, is that they didn't actually use data about the pathogen. So increasingly everyone was using COVID data and things, but in terms of really understanding sort of mobility through the lens of who might be infected, who might be moving, and how that relates to the actual cases, pretty much all the papers were still really lacking on any metadata. So they were using sort of like proxy data sets like mobile phone data saying that like this is how this county is connected to this other county. And it was very unusual to have information about sort of infection status of individuals, any adjustment about who might be in that data set, or any understanding about what types of mobility you might be measuring. And one other final little bone to pick is that very few of these papers actually included anyone from public health agencies. So while there was sort of an abundance of public health agencies wanting to digest and sort of use models or use outputs from mobility data, there still, I think, is a lot of lack of harmonization and integration between sort of the academic side and the more public health side. So that was a very quick overview of sort of thinking about this one particular aspect of ways that we can use different kinds of data and ways we can try to understand different disease processes. And going forward, we're really interested in thinking a little bit more about how do we know that the mobility data that we're getting and measuring is actually useful or informative to understand different pathogens. So I mentioned sort of that bigger bias where you might have kids who are moving and you're collecting data on adults, which might be sort of a proxy measure, but sort of better understanding sort of what pathogen you're really interested in understanding the spread and how well can some of these data sets and models really be used to capture the epidemiologically relevant mobility patterns, particularly as we're interested in thinking about not just current pathogens, but also ones going forward. And there are many people involved in all of this work and a large number of funders too. Thank you very much.